Okay, folks, today we're going to go ahead and address another one of these Political Hillbilly videos. More specifically, this one here entitled Political Hillbilly Solves Sandy Hook. Very bold statement to make. We'll check into the veracity of that claim here in a moment. But first, a couple brief notes on my last video where we fact-checked the Hillbilly's claim about Connecticut State Police being on scene prior to the Sandy Hook shooting. Yes, the sore loser did post a rather lengthy and expletive-laced rebuttal, and believe it or not, actually tried to walk back his claim that these dispatch and arrival times were exclusive to December 14th, 2012. I mean, check this out.
The times listed on this report are exclusive to the 14th.
I never said they was exclusive. I said they was related.
No. Let me refresh your memory there, Hillbilly.
So here's some major discrepancies. Dispatch 0025. People know how to tell military time? This is 25 minutes after 12 in the morning of December 14th. December 13th just went by, 25 minutes after midnight.
Yes, that's right. These are your words, Mr. Hillbilly. Okay, so there's no denying that you randomly picked times from these columns and insisted they were from the 14th. So don't try and play that game with me, fella. Then he goes on to basically say, all right then, if it's not for December 14th, then it's your responsibility to determine what day they're referring to.
Mr. Johnson, show me a report for this time. Don't show me the report for his second entry. Show me a report or an amended report documenting what he was doing there.
No. Once again, that's not how it works, Mr. Hillbilly. You made a specific claim offering up this document right here as your evidence. I checked into your claim, and using the very same document, I conclusively proved that it does not support your argument. My work is done. I don't have to prove jack shit. However, if you want to continue making this absurd claim, for instance, that this 7:49 a.m. arrival time, dispatch and arrival time is for the 14th, then it is up to you to find another form of supporting documentation. This one here, you can't use. So good luck with that. Because you ain't going to find it. The final report, the totality of the evidence, everything we know about what happened that day clearly contradicts your claims that Connecticut State Police were on scene in the parking lot, as you put it, prior to 9:30 a.m. on December 14th. Okay? So as far as that particular ridiculous claim of yours, you and I are done. We are through with that. Okay, so moving on to our feature presentation concerning this video here, Political Hillbilly Solves Sandy Hook. He's posted quite a few videos since the one we just discussed, but this one is one of his crowning achievements, so that's why we're going to discuss it. It says here it was published on July 30th, 2015, and it says this video is one of 5 of my bombshells proving the lie sold to the sheeple. Okay, so that's a very, very bold statement to make, and we're going to check into that. But instead of starting from the beginning, we're going to shoot all the way to the ass end of this video where he reaches his conclusions. And part of that is showing a clip from an interview conducted with Gene Rosen. So let's start right there.
These 2 boys were crying furiously. They were wailing. I can't go back to the school. We can't go back to the school. We can't go back to the school. We don't have a teacher. We don't have a teacher. Mrs. Soto. Mrs. Soto is dead. There's blood. She had blood in her mouth, and she fell, and there was 2 guns, a big gun and a small gun. And that...
As they were saying this...
Excuse me, Mr. Rosen. Political Hillbilly for speaking we the people who represent truth, justice, and accountability. We would like to ask you one question, Mr. Rosen. If the kids left prior to the shooting? How did they know their teacher was dead? How did they see the blood? How did they know there was 2 guns, Mr. Rosen? You liar.
Okay, so you heard it, folks. Now, how did the political hillbilly reach this conclusion? Well, according to him, the arrival time here that you see in red on the top of the page, and the statement, which follows below, that we have for Connecticut State Police Sgt. William Cario, clearly contradicts the plausibility of the timeline of the shooting. In other words, if Cario's arrival time and statement is true, then according to the political hillbilly, there is no way that the escaping children from room 10, which is Ms. Soto's classroom, there's no way that they could have possibly witnessed the murder of their teacher. Okay, you follow along with that? Now, to make his case, he refers to the timeline that is provided to us in the final report and shows us the approximate time that these shots were heard, which was about 9:34 a.m. By this time, the shooter had already gained access by blasting out the front glass and was storming through the school. And it was also during this time that some of the children escaped and were seen running down the sidewalk. Some of these children eventually made their way to Gene Rosen's house. Then 5-6 minutes later, a single gunshot is heard in the background. This is believed to be the final suicide shot from the shooter who's in room 10, Ms. Soto's room. Now, just prior to that time, Newtown officers, including Officer Chapman, have pulled up to the scene and are in the process of making their way into the school. 6 minutes later, at 9:46 a.m., Connecticut State Police Sgt. William Cario arrives, and it takes him very little time to enter the school. Now, this is several minutes after the final suicide shot and after some of those children had already escaped. Okay, so here's where the political hillbilly comes in. He gives us his take on Sergeant Cario's statement. And for that, we are going to play an excerpt from his previous video because this is where he says it best. He's actually said the same thing several times in other videos, but this is the best version. Now, just to give you some background, Sergeant Cario has entered the school already through the front entrance and is in the lobby where he meets 2 Newtown police officers. One is definitely William Chapman. The other is almost certainly Scott Smith. Now, remember, both these officers got there more than 6 minutes earlier and heard the final gunshots upon arrival. Okay.
I direct your attention down here to the middle. You guys go ahead and read it. There's going to be several videos come out here. But I want to direct your attention here to the middle or the bottom of the second paragraph. The officer that spoke, and he's referring to Officer Chapman, reported they are dead, pointing to 2 bodies in the hall. The shooter was in the hall, ducked into the classroom to the left. There was a volley of gunfire, and it's been quiet for about 5 minutes. Okay, so if he got here at 9:46 and 30 seconds, but yet Adams reported dead at 9:41, how in the hell did he see him go into the classroom 10? How in the hell did he go unchallenged without an exchange of gunfire from the police if they saw him in room 10? Why is it Officer Chapman does not report seeing him in the hallway? A lot of questions, a lot of them going to come out of Sergeant Carroll here. So trolls, if you can answer that, then all means I'll retire the political hillbilly. If you cannot answer that, keep your comments off my comment section because I don't deal in disinformation like your head troll, Keith Johnson.
Okay, well, let's ignore that last part and move directly onto his claim, okay? First, he claims that Officer Chapman was the officer who spoke here and reported they are dead, pointing to the 2 bodies in the hall. Well, it may have been Chapman who spoke, or it may have been the other average size officer, whom we believe to be Scott Smith. That's a minor point, though. The bigger issue is that the political hillbilly attributes this statement, and this statement only, to the officer who spoke. they are dead, in parentheses here. Everything else that follows, so says the political hillbilly, is eyewitness testimony from Sergeant Cario. Okay? According to the political hillbilly, Sergeant Cario says he saw the shooter in the hallway, that he ducked into a classroom to the left, that there was a volley of gunfire, and that it's been quiet for about 5 minutes. Now, I had to replay this several times to hear if my ears were deceiving me. Is political hillbilly really standing by this claim that all of this is eyewitness testimony from Sergeant Cario? Well, yes, he is, and we know this by visiting the comment section of his video. First of all, we have this comment from a fellow hoaxer of his who disagrees with him and says, I also think he was relaying what Chapman said to him. And this was the political hillbilly's reply. The only thing that Chapman says is they are dead, then pointed at the bodies. Then it is back to Cario's statement. Okay? So we know where he's coming from. There's no doubt about it. But he's absolutely 100% wrong. And all we have to do is apply some simple 7th grade level English to our analysis of this statement. Now remember, Sergeant Cario wrote this himself. So everything in parentheses here is a quote from someone else. Okay, in this case, the quotes are coming from the officer who spoke. And he only puts in quotes words that he specifically remembers hearing. Everything else is paraphrasing. In other words, the officer said these things, but perhaps not using those exact words, like the shooter was in the hallway. Okay? Now, I know this, folks, because I've written literally hundreds of articles that have passed the scrutiny of editors. I know my craft. This is not up for debate. This is conclusive. The political hillbilly simply has a problem with reading comprehension and has misrepresented the facts based on his faulty interpretation of Cario's statement. So his theory is bunk, about as bunk as you can get. Now let's go over this here, this statement. The officer that spoke reported that, quote unquote, they are dead. These are words that Cario specifically remembers hearing from this officer, pointing to the two bodies in the hall. Comma, not period, but comma. In other words, this officer is continuing on with his laundry list of things that he is reporting. The shooter was in the hallway and, quote unquote, ducked. Cario specifically remembers this officer to say that he ducked into a classroom to the left front. Comma, continuing on with his report, there was a volley of gunfire. Comma, and, quote unquote, it's been quiet for about 5 minutes. All of this is what this officer is relating to Cario. None of this is eyewitness testimony from Cario. Case closed.
There you go, people. There's one of 5 bombshells.
Okay, let's leave the political hillbilly there for a moment and entertain some of your questions. For instance, you may be asking, how did Officer Chapman or Officer Smith, whoever this officer is that spoke, how did he know that the shooter had been in the hallway and then ducked into a room on the left? Now, those are a couple fair questions to ask. And I think by looking at the final report and reading the statements of these two officers, as well as a statement from one of the victims, that we can come to a pretty logical conclusion. Now, what follows here, ladies and gentlemen, is a segue into another video that I plan on making in the very near future. And it concerns statements made by Lieutenant Vance in the early aftermath of the shooting, statements he made to a reporter in response to a question this reporter asked. And I think most of you know what I'm referring to. But this is primarily the reason why I decided to address the political hillbilly's recent video, because it allows me an opportunity to lay the groundwork for that upcoming video. Okay? Okay, as I lay out my case here, first thing you need to acknowledge is that the officer who spoke, whether that be Chapman or Smith, At no time did they say that they personally witnessed the shooter in the hallway, nor did they witness him ducking into a classroom. All they said was the shooter was in the hallway and ducked into a classroom. All right? Okay, now in order to determine how these officers reached that conclusion, we need to read their statements, both of which can be found in Book 6. We also need to look at Book 3 and read the partial statement from victim Natalie Hammond. And I think between the three of these individuals, the statements that they gave, we can come up with a pretty good idea of where this idea came from, that the shooter was in the hallway and then ducked into a room on the left. Now, rather than me reading word for word from each one of these statements, I'm going to give a summary based upon my reading. If you want to verify my facts, then by all means, pull up these documents and do your own bit of fact checking. Now, I also want to stress that these officers, each one of them, and this victim had unique experiences. Okay, so although Chapman and Smith may have been in the same place at the same time, Officer Chapman may recall things that Smith didn't, and vice versa. You have to understand that this was probably the most traumatic experience they've ever witnessed in their entire lives. This is a chaotic scene, and their first priority is to take care of witnesses and ensure their own safety. The last thing they're thinking about is crossing every T and dotting every I. So we need to keep that in mind. There will be errors and omissions, but a case is not made from one individual statement. It's the totality of all the evidence. So please keep that in mind as we proceed. Okay, here's a rough floor plan of the Sandy Hook Elementary School, and we're going to start our analysis a few minutes after 9:40 a.m. This is after Officers Chapman and Smith of the Newtown Police Department heard the final shots, including the suicide shot. It's been several minutes since the children escaped from room 10. So these officers have entered the school into the lobby and see the two dead adults on the floor outside of this main office. And they decide amongst themselves that they are now going to systematically clear rooms or check rooms along this hallway, starting with the room to their immediate right, which is the principal's office. Then they cross over to room 12 and they don't see the teacher or students there because they're hiding. Then, according to Officer Smith's statement, he checked this closet and saw nothing but equipment there. So they move on to the conference room, room 9, and that's where they encounter Natalie Hammond, who is alive but wounded. Now, for those unaware, Natalie Hammond was an adult teacher, a lead teacher, in fact, an administrative position with the Sandy Hook Elementary School. She was in room 9 with a parent and several other staff members when they heard a sound which sounded like pipes banging. That's when Principal Don Hawksbrom and psychologist Mary Sherlock exited the room. Hammond was about 15 feet behind them. She stated that as she exited the room, she heard gunshots and then saw Hawksbrom and Sherlock fall down in front of her. Then she got shot herself in the leg. She describes the gunman as a male, 5'8" to 5'11". She then goes on to say that once she was shot, she fell down and laid still in the hallway. And she remained there for about 10 seconds before crawling back into room 9. But just before she crawls back into room 9, she looks down the hallway and no longer sees the shooter. That's what she told the investigating officer who took her statement as she was being treated for her wounds. Okay, back to room 9. Both Officers Chapman and Smith are in there. They observe several female adults in that room. According to Officer Smith, I recognize one adult as Natalie Hammond. Natalie Hammond indicated she had been shot in the leg and arm. I did not observe a large amount of blood, and the wounds did not appear life-threatening at that time. Then he goes on to say that all other adults stated that they were uninjured. Natalie Hammond stated that she saw the shooter but was able to provide a very accurate description. Okay, so this is what we know about that conversation based on his report only. We're not privy to every single exact word that was related to him, but we can assume that being a good officer, he milked her for as much information as possible. Okay, now we shoot over to Officer Chapman's statement and his personal recollection as he exited the room. Saw a master sergeant from Connecticut State Police standing in the lobby, as well as possibly 2 or 3 other troopers. I advised him that if cover was available, we needed 2 troopers to remove the injured female. I recall that every time I looked behind me toward the entrance to the school, I could see more and more troopers coming on to the scene. Now, who is this Master Sergeant? Well, none other than Lieutenant, otherwise known as Master Sergeant Davis, who, along with Sergeant Cario, entered the Sandy Hook Elementary School at the same time. And you could verify that from reading both of these individual statements. Okay, so that brings us full circle back to this statement by Sergeant Cario. We have them all 4 together now as Officer Chapman and Smith exit room 9 and encounter these 2 representatives from the Connecticut State Police, one of them being Master Sergeant or Lieutenant Davis and Sergeant Cario. And one of these Newtown police officers, whether it be Smith or Chapman, states or reports they are dead, pointing to the 2 bodies in the hall. That's from their own personal observations. The shooter was in the hallway and ducked into a classroom to the left. This is information that they're relating based on their interaction with Natalie Hammond. There was a volley of gunfire, which both Newtown officers heard prior to entering the school, and it's been quiet for about 5 minutes. Now remember the time frame. We have 2 Connecticut State Police representatives coming into the school at 9:46 a.m., which is about the time that they're talking to these 2 Newtown police officers who say that it's been quiet for about 5 minutes. Remember, those last shots that they heard were at approximately 9:40 a.m. So 5 minutes fits well within that time frame. The time frame has not been corrupted in any way. Any questions? Oh, and I'm sure that hoaxers will bombard me with many questions, such as why didn't Chapman mention telling the CSP that the shooter was seen in the hallway, or why doesn't Officer Smith mention in his statement seeing the CSP when he exited room 9, or how come no one other than Cario mentions the shooter ducking into a classroom to the left, Well, folks, I think that a reasonable person, and especially veteran law enforcement officers, would agree with me that that's no cause for suspicion. I mean, just because an officer or witness fails to provide a particular detail in their statement doesn't mean it didn't happen. That detail may have been excluded because they didn't specifically remember it, or because they felt it was immaterial to their report. Or this could have been a factor as well. What this report refers to as acute dissociative responses in law enforcement officers involved in critical shooting incidents, where the authors of this report surveyed 115 law enforcement officers and found that 90% of them reported experiencing a dissociative response during the critical incident. 90%, folks. That's a big, big percentage. And you go down here and you look at the results of their study, where they found 74% of the subjects reported auditory distortion, 51 reported sounds were quieter, 23 said that sounds were louder, 22% of the officers reported memory loss for part of the incident, which the authors suggest might be relevant, particularly since an officer may be asked to testify about his or her actions at some point in the future. So that's significant, folks. So let's give these officers a break for not clinging to every single tiny detail of this traumatic incident, one of the most horrific school shootings in American history. And like I said, folks, it's the totality of the evidence, not any one individual's statement. But for purposes of us trying to determine how these officers concluded that the shooter was in the hallway and ducked into another room, I think the key here is Natalie Hammond. She was a key witness to the shooter's movements and very attentive to what he was doing, even going so far as describing the number of breaks in the shooting and hearing him reload. So she was almost certainly the source for that statement overheard by Cario, of course not directly to his ear, first passing through Officer Chapman or Officer Smith or both, and then ultimately getting to Cario. And that's the way I see it. I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of controversy about my conclusions, but so be it. And let's end on a humorous note, and for that we return back to the Political Hillbilly. He's got a video up there called Sandy Hook Missing Crops / Johnson Trolls. Well, the key word here is crops, which he meant to say corpse, and I hope if he decides to change that that he writes C-O-R-P-S with an E at the end. That's how you spell corpse. But missing crops. Now, that wouldn't happen to be a Freudian slip there, would it, Mr. Hillbilly? But nevertheless, since we're on the subject of that video, why don't we go ahead and take a listen to the point he's trying to make in it.
Let's see, the first thing I observed was a female body lying in the floor in a supine position against the wall adjacent to the main office. So he only observes one female in the hallway shot. Missing corpse. All right, now to bring clarification. The body was surrounded by a pool of blood, which made me realize the school shooting had taken place or is in progress.
Okay, once again, we are encountering a problem with reading comprehension on behalf of the Political Hillbilly. Here he is reading from a statement by Newtown officer Leonard Penna, and nothing in these two sentences indicates that there's a missing corpse. Officer Penna simply states that the first thing he observed was a female body lying on the floor, and the reason he says this is to make a larger point, which comes in the second sentence. The body was surrounded by a pool of blood, which made me then realize that a school shooting had taken place and or in the process. So he's alerting us as to what initial observation led him to this frame of mind. Okay? So that gives you some indication of what we're dealing with when it comes to the Political Hillbilly. So please forgive me if I don't jump at debunking his next video, because quite frankly I find it a waste of time and I have bigger fish to fry. So anyway, that'll do it for this edition of Sandy Hook Hoaxers Debunked. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Until next time, this is Keith Johnson, signing off.